I welcome people who have gathered here as well as people who have joined us over the virtual medium. Today is the second edition of Reading Hub. Reading Hub was the idea of a joint idea of Dravidian Professionals Forum and the Roja Muthaiah Research Library. Actually, the idea came from one person, the Honorable Minister of Finance and Human Resource Management, Dr. Panivel Tyagarajan. We are so happy to have this reading hub. The first book was taken was The Journey of Civilization by R. Balakrishnan. And today we have another interesting, wonderful book by the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, Home in the World, Memoir. And where, Amartya Sen talks about the idea of home. Because he himself has lived in several places like Dhaka, Calcutta, Delhi, UK, and back in Delhi, of course. So his worldview of the idea of home, the idea of justice, can be seen in this book, which will be reviewed by a senior journalist and head of Center for Study in Public Sphere, Mr. A.S. Pannerselvan. Actually, he needs no introduction. He's a senior journalist. He has been with Sun Network. He has been with The Hindu. In fact, he served as the reader's editor for The Hindu till recently. And he has been with Panel South Asia, where Panel South Asia has presence in at least 5 countries. He is a member of the KM Adi Moolam Foundation. He was a fellow at the Reuters. He's been a Reuters fellow in 1989, I think, 1989. And he's been teaching journalism in several places. And the most important place here, of course, is the Asian College of Journalism. And he has produced and written a wonderful book on the senior statesman of India, our former Chief Minister, Mr. M. Karunanidhi, his life, a biography of Mr. Karunanidhi. So, which was published by the Penguin. He's a publisher. He's been involved in theatre. He's been involved in several aspects. So, I invite Mr. S. Pannerselvan to present about Home in the World, Memoir by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. And once again, I welcome all of you. But we will not be taking questions at the end of this, but it's a review of the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunder. Am I clear? See, everybody gets into the world of books with some entry point. For me, my entry point in the world of ideas comes from my understanding of Tamil modernity. In the sense, Vadalar becomes an entry point for a range of my understanding. So when he started using that word, that became a very, very defining element in my life. Therefore, the idea of freedom from illness and freedom from hunger, the two governing theme of Vadalar, becomes a bedrock of the modernity itself. If we want to distill modernity, modernity empowers people to negotiate these two issues, negotiating hunger and negotiating illness. So freedom from illness and freedom from hunger becomes the cornerstone of the modern nation state. And much later, in 1998, when Amartya Sen got his Nobel Prize, we tried to understand Amartya Sen's contribution through his other works. One element was looking at Amartya Sen's phenomenal work on the Bengal famine. When we started looking at Amartya Sen's work on Bengal famine, the key subject, what we learned was, and it was very, very supportive to me as a journalist, because he said that the one way to confront major disaster like famine is to have credible information. If you have credible information, you actually bring down the blow of these type of disasters. And his contention is that wherever there is a free and credible journalism, the impact of natural disasters are much lower. But that's what he establishes in his study on famines. But that intervention becomes very, very important because that again flows into something else where he, in association with this wonderful Pakistani economist, when they developed this Human Development Index, part of the issues they brought in is empowerment. But unless and otherwise empowerment is being embedded in the policy making, your economics is going to be purely market driven. If you have to move from market driven metrics towards an inclusive macroeconomic indicators, you have to make it inclusive. That was the essential argument which Mr. Sen was making. And that was very, very interesting because we entered it into that world much later. Only when he got his Nobel Prize, we wanted to understand what was his contribution. But in that sense, I am not a student of economics. I come from the world of science, and I made this lateral induction to journalism. Before my formal training in economics is next to nothing, but this was a very, very interesting and opening idea. And the next issue was his book called Argumentative Indian. Argumentative Indian becomes really interesting because the crux of that book is debate and dissent. And for the debate and dissent, he draws extensively from the early Sanskrit tradition and the early Buddhist tradition. The way his understanding of Sanskrit and Buddhism and Pali contributes to his understanding of argumentative Indian. Along with the argumentative Indian, the next book from him, which was extremely accessible to everybody, was his idea of justice. His idea of justice was a departure from Rawls' theory of justice. After John Rawls had come up with theory of justice, Amartya Sen works on this idea of justice to make idea of justice much more inclusive. Again, in idea of justice, one aspect which keeps recurring is the idea of credible information. He says, unless and otherwise we have credible information, there is no choice of making informed decisions. If we want to make informed decisions, we need credible information. It's as simple as that, and there. Now, to have an economist who is also running a philosophy program becomes really interesting, because generally we don't associate economics and philosophy together. And here is an academic who is both a professor of philosophy and the professor of economics. To look at this intertwining of economics and philosophy becomes so interesting for us to locate Dr. Sen's personal journey. His personal journey has been extremely well documented through any number of stories for years, and including some fine recollections by his students like Kaushik Basu and others. But for Amartya Sen to write his autobiography becomes really important because for the first time, we are looking at this trajectory of pre-colonial India to a newly emerged country which is trying to find its own identity. But that journey, the book ends with Amartya Sen joining Delhi University, Delhi School, which means it ends with the height of Nehruvian era, with K.N. Raj establishing Delhi School and he joining there. With that, it ends, which means it's a mid-50s, which means it's a completely different era with which he ends. But he gives an idea of what were the imaginations which went through this entire period. And he draws from three different interesting human beings. First is his grandfather. His grandfather is a major influence on him. His grandfather was a teacher in Shantiniketan. So from his grandfather, he gets into the world of Sanskrit knowledge, and Pali. With this entire Buddhist text and the Sanskrit Indian classical text, he learns through his grandfather. Then through his father, he is able to travel to three different cities. Dhaka, where his father starts. From Dhaka, they go to Mandalay. From Mandalay, they come back to Dhaka, and then from Dhaka to Calcutta. But this Dhaka, Mandalay, Dhaka, Calcutta becomes again a very, very interesting opening point. In all these centers, there are enough data and recollections to help us understand present. For instance, is a recollection of the Dhaka gives us an idea of, wow, Bangladesh, which had all social indicators at such a low level in 1971 and in 72 when it was established as a country, that cusp between 71 and 72 where its indicators were so low, for it to overtake India on certain key indicators. How did that journey happen? There he has one interesting chapter on the linguistic pride, the Bangla pride. With this Bangla versus Urdu tension. And the way this entire two-nation theory of Jinnah gets subverted by the idea of linguistic pride becomes so central. So for a person who is from Tamil Nadu, where we are used to this idea of linguistic assertion, we are able to relate to it in a much more easier manner. Therefore, we are able to see that Bangladesh emerging out of two-nation theory, using language as an entry point becomes another interesting element. His section on Burma is as important as what George Orwell has written on Burma. Because this is written from a person who feels that his friend Aung San Suu Kyi and her husband Michael Harris was a friend of Amartya, who represented promise, but who failed in delivering that promise. Therefore, his anger against Aung San Suu Kyi not to act when the army went ahead with its excesses against Rohingyas. He documents it very well. Therefore, what happens is this memoir keeps oscillating between present and the past. Though the book ends with Amartya becoming the professor at DU, in each of these cities, he is also able to relate those developments to the present. Hence, it becomes so central to our imagination. Another aspect is influence of Tagore. The most profound influence of Tagore is Tagore alerts them about the danger of ultra-nationalism. And the most interesting one is Tagore alerts them at the time of India's anti-colonial struggle. To take a stand against the fervor of nationalism in a general environment is easy. But to take a stand against nationalism when the country is going through an anti-colonial struggle needs enormous wisdom. And that was the wisdom which came from Tagore. And that is the one which he easily incorporates. And partly, the title of this book is his way of saying thank you to Tagore. Tagore's most famed novel is called Home and the World. What he calls this is Home in the World. This is his way of saying thank you to Tagore. But as a person from Tamil Nadu, I somehow felt that a person of his eminence should have also looked at what happened in other South Asian languages, say like Tamil, because that would have actually enriched his worldview. For instance, this Home in the World and Yadum Ure Yavarum Keli are not really far away. A person who has done this extensive study on the Sanskrit literature, for him, the Tamil literature would have opened up a extremely enchanting new world. And that extremely enchanting new world seems to be absent in this entire narrative. If you're looking at this book, and if you think that something is missing, that is this experience. That experience would have added up one more layer. But having said that, if you're reading the book, you're not going to notice this lack because the book is so rich. It is enchanting in its own way because in each and every element, what he is doing is he is looking at place, people, and policy, and looking at that interaction between these three things. Where the place is not purely a geographical creation, people are not passive entities, and policies are not purely about dominance dependency. And using that framework is what he is entering into his analysis of the famine. He says that the Bengal famine took such a huge toll primarily because colonialists had a completely different idea of managing the crisis rather than addressing the crisis. The food was not supplied. With this great administrative ability of Winston Churchill is the one which contributed to the death of nearly 2 million people. Whether his idea is, are we going to look at addressing the issue or we are going to look at managing the issue? The colonial idea of looking at famine was to manage the famine, not to address that famine. But the primary lens through which you look at these developments, he captures it very well. And these are no longer purely a conceptual framework because he managed to convert them into policy framework for very many countries. Therefore, if the HDI helped a lot of countries to come up with affirmative actions to address these issues, it came because of their work. Now, having said all these things, one area where he has a very, very fine idea is the role of educational institution. And there is one big section on Nalanda. Therefore, there is a section which deals with the historical Nalanda University, and there is a section where he doesn't really talk much about the Nalanda University for which he was appointed as the first chancellor and which was killed by this government. Therefore, we don't know, he's not talking about it, but by talking about the old Nalanda and talking about the role of the educational institution, he also creates a sense of space to look at how to look at education, how to look at knowledge as an empowering tool. But this knowledge as an empowering tool keeps coming recurringly in this book. And it comes with a certain amount of effortless ease. And to do this, he is doing something which is very, very interesting. That is, he is not drawing only from classical economic theory. He draws extensively from different forms of articulation. He draws from theater, he draws from literature, he draws from ancient texts, he draws from folklore, he draws from music, with the idea of sourcing it from multiple sources gives it different types of vibrancy. And that vibrancy leads to a very, very interesting aspect of looking at a city like Delhi. If you're looking at a person who was born in Dhaka, grew up in partly in Mandalay, back in Dhaka, Calcutta, and then educated in Cambridge. He's coming to Delhi primarily because he thinks it as a new place to create possibilities. Therefore, for him, what K and Raj did is creating the possibilities, which means it was not frozen in a particular mold. It was a place which was fluid. It was a place where you can come up with certain variations. That's the reason it becomes really interesting. And there I would like to actually read out a small portion where it talks about one aspect is he was born in his maternal grandmother's place. He says that that is one issue which all of us has to understand, because people will still believe that only the mother's side takes care of a person during pregnancy and its difficulties. But there is a gender angle to it. He says it's not that my mother went to her parents' place and she delivered me there. But that entire custom is primarily because of the way the society operates, where the trust factor is. Where it is that entire trust factor brings in the gender dimensions to it. For him, again, the gender is not restricted to some indicators. Gender is about how the society responds to even as elementary as childbirth. I'll just read out that small section. Okay. I think we are online, if I will be spending so much of time looking for it, located. Just one. If that was the case, another interesting thing is about water. About water, there are two elements which is he's looking at water as a giver and water as a problematic one. Whereas a person who's spent so much of time in Bangladesh is looking rivers both as a life giver and rivers as a life threatening entities. So what he did is has done a fine reading or sort of a encyclopedic reading of the documentation of river in the Bengali literature. But the two pages, he actually encapsulates the way Bengali literature looks at river. For instance, he says, that's how it, let me read from Mr. Sen himself. The fascination with rivers in Bengali literature goes back to the early days when Bengali emerged as a language with a serious grammar around the 10th century, differing greatly from Sanskrit. It had a close connection with a popular version of classical Sanskrit called Prakrit. The old Bengali tales were very involved with the rivers. For example, the much read and critically admired Manasaka Mangal Kavya, dating to the late 15th century, is set almost entirely on the river Ganga Bhagirathi and tells us of the adventure and the ultimate defeat of the merchant Chand, who revolted against the ruling cult of Manasha, the snake goddess, only to die in the process. It also makes an excellent play. I was disappointed as a child by Manasha Mangal since I wanted Chand, the defiant merchant, to triumph over the nasty snake goddess. I also remember being generally frustrated by the powers of supernatural entities in popular stories and dramas and hoped they would be vanquished. That would happen occasionally, but any satisfaction I then had was extensively undermined when I went to the United States later in life and noticed the vigor and popularity of the supernatural agents on American television, especially on cable TV late in the evenings. You'll start watching trustfully what looks like a crime and detection story. But when the cornered villain opens his shapely mouth, there emanates a 10-foot long tongue, which is apparently no surprise to the trained American audience. As a plot develops further, many physical norms are overturned. That's how he gets into it. The idea is uh, on the river-based literature, he returns after looking at the American television, says that river-based literature in ancient Bengali varies greatly in concentration and themes. I was particularly thrilled when I read the early Bengali rumination of Buddhist thought in the ancient Charapad or Charyapad in Sanskrit. They date from the 10th and 12th century and are among the earliest identifiably Bengali writings. They are good to read both for literary reasons, though you need some practice to see clearly how the old words correspond to the modern Bengali versions, and for historical interest for what they tell us about the lives and priorities of these dedicated Buddhists. The author expresses a sense of victory in verse, reporting cheerfully that he has been robbed of his wealth on the river Pada and that he has also married a woman from a very low caste and now a true Bengali. I have stirred the thunderbolt along the coast of Pada. The pirates have robbed me of my misery. Ukasu, today you have become a true Bengali, having taken a Chandal woman as your wife. That's how the poetry goes. Detachment from property and the Buddhist defense of caste. Chandals have been categorized among the lowest, clearly fits into the idea of Buddhist egalitarian imagination of Bengal around that time. If the idea is, though he starts looking at the way river was negotiated in the literature, he gets into the social history of the state. And that is the most fascinating element of this memoir. This memoir goes in various spirals and loops. It starts in one and it immediately spirals off into an interconnected another development. And he does it with certain amount of effortless ease. That's what makes it exciting. There is no attempt to create a theoretical construct over this entire aspect. Nowhere in the book, Home in the World, you're going to find that these are the elements I took for my social choices. These are the elements I took for my idea of entitlement. These are the ideas I took to create our matrix for Human Development Index. These are the elements what we took to work on our theory of justice. These are the elements what I took for argumentative debate. No, it's never said. But for any reader, these things come out easily. They are able to make the connections. And that's what makes this book really interesting, because next generation policymakers, this might be a interesting wellspring. These interesting element of putting elements together. One aspect which has come out very well is him joining the Delhi school. K. N. Raj calls and says that, okay, do you want to come and join? He says, what do you mean? Is there an offer for me? He says, no, the present chair is willing to give it up if he finds a worthy successor. He says that, what do you mean? You established a major center for economics and it's called the Delhi School. And you're saying yeah, that's how it is. And he says yes, and he gets a job. And that type of opening, I don't think it's any longer exists. Because the similar stories we heard was about Tamil Nadu getting Mr. Malcolm Adisesha, where they said, why don't you come back and become the vice chancellor? He agreed and he came back. And Malcolm, in his way, brought in somebody like Anantha Krishnan. There were these type of talents being laterally inducted into our academia. I think the last major talent to be inducted should be Professor Anantha Krishnan. I don't think after that we managed to see it. And now the way we are looking at the lateral induction being restricted only to sharing of positions to the people with whom you share your ideological position. That's another issue which we need to address. One aspect which I was about the health, why it's becoming really important, because Amartya Sen was directed with cancer as a young student in Calcutta. And the doctor said he's not going to survive. And he defied the doctors and he's still there. This defense, that is the one which actually contributes a lot towards investment in public health. There were personal experiences, no longer a personal experience. He is able to contextualize his various personal experience into a collective good. To transform your personal experience into collective good is a job of a scholar, and that Professor Sen does it with enormous ease and insight. Initially, I was a bit diffident to read his books because I thought that it's going to be economics, it'll be too many formulas, it'll be beyond my reach. But when I went into it, what I realized is the essential elements there are ethical obligation to a fellow human being. If you actually distill all his work, what we are going to get is what are our ethical obligations to a fellow human being. And the moment we realize that here is a person who is consciously addressing what are our ethical obligations to a fellow human being, then it opens up the space in a brilliant manner. Therefore, whether it is his relationship with his cousins, who were a far better cricket player than him, and he was such a bad player, he records it. It was not about the relationship between the cousins, it's about the interaction, about mutual learning. And the idea is your cousins are not only your first set of friends, but they're also the first set of your mutual learners. But that entire idea of mutual learning is the theme through which this book moves. And learning is not a passive act, or learning is not only from textbook. Learning happens through being a witness to a whole range of developments. He was a witness to the way his father was dealing with the establishment of the university, or with the creation of the new laws, or with Shantini Ketan when Ram Kinkar Beige and Bendranath Tagore and others were looking at the visual sensibilities. What was those influences? But these things, by being witness to these things, you learn. There was few things you learn by pursuing that discipline, and few things you learn by being a witness. Therefore, the learning is actually individual's ability to soak up things. And how did he soak up those things? That's what he documents. And he makes one thing very, very clear. That is, his knowledge base is not restricted to a singular origin. It is from a truly diverse origin. And the importance of having a democratic setup is to have a diverse origin. Home in the World gives us some tools to deal with the idea of democracy and coexistence. It's the most important one. Let me just tell you. See, for instance, the cancer issue. There is a full chapter on from it was detected till he was initially cured of it, and that keeps recurring. There's a relapse, and later he had to be treated again. Since the question is not about your discomfort at that time, the question is, do we have a system to address these things? And it can happen to anybody. So this idea of state or the institutions to be responsive, he draws those idea of responsiveness of the states and the institutions from personal experiences. But these personal experiences are not about dirge. Personal experiences are not about my own saga, but the personal experiences are about how to transform these experiences into some sort of a workable model. That's the reason these personal experiences resonate. One interesting aspect during talking about cancer is there is a section on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It says, okay, I have cancer. Let's look at man-induced cancer. You went and you dropped nuclear bomb. That is going to generate so much of cancer. What he does is he immediately transforms a personal experience into a universal experience and tries to draw attention to certain universal realities. And that's the reason it becomes so moving at the end of the day. At some level, you find that the book ends abruptly in Delhi. But the idea is the book ends in Delhi at the time when Amartya Sen had become a big personality. Actually, after Delhi, wherever Amartya Sen went, he went as a celebrity scholar. Therefore, what book does is it captures his journey till he becomes a celebrity scholar. And post-celebrity scholar Amartya Sen's life has been extremely well documented. Therefore, I don't think it's going to be, there's a lacuna here. But central aspect for me as a person who had written a biography of an politician earlier is that autobiographies have a particular ability to inform. I went through another autobiography which was by writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Living to Tell was the name of the store, his autobiography. In these autobiographies, you come up with some nuggets which are flashes of truth. And these flashes of truth are never expanded into one big chapter. They are in one sentence or in, they come and they go, but they actually open up this space. For instance, His father was called doctor, though he is a academic doctor, PhD man. But people came to him for medical advice. And in an area where there was very little medical infrastructure, you're not going to turn around and say that I'm not that doctor. You're going to say that, okay, do this, go and meet him, he will help you. Therefore, that entire guiding to a medical doctor is an act where you get two things recorded. One is the society was not having enough institutional arrangement to address that issue. And second, people are not aware to make these distinctions. And the moment we realize that this is the social indicators of the Indian subcontinent around the time of our independence, we can actually see where we have traveled. For us to know our own journey, these uh, instances, he's not using any of the figures. He's not saying that a literary rate was some 17%, or he's not using any figures. He's talking about human experiences. And that transforming these human experiences to understand our own journey is what makes this book really interesting. As I said earlier, the section on social choice is so interesting because they did not arrive on it purely using the economic matrices. They arrived using a whole range of ethical and philosophical questions. The idea of social choices was not purely an idea of economic theory. Next is on the question of nationalism. He says this question of nationalism is the one where we all have to think through it fully. He says that Tagore managed to do it, but after Tagore, we are not really addressing it adequately. Unless and otherwise, we are going to address the question of nationalism adequately. Nationalism can become a debilitating issue. Should be able to look at that idea of nationalism in a more organic manner. That is the one thing which the book gets into the idea of nationalism when Tagore dies. Sen was in Santiniketan, and he was looking at that. What is the impact of this? How to look at this? He says that people talk about his Nobel Prize. People talk about his impact in the West. One reason why it resonated with the West was his book happened between the two war years. And therefore, the war, they have already paid a big price for ultra-nationalism. The price, what they paid because of the war, is the one which helped them to recognize the wisdom of this man. This is like South India is not fully aware of the price what we paid during the partition migration, because it was far away. Similarly, we didn't. I don't think Indian subcontinent really realized the idea of nationalism as articulated by Tagore, primarily because we didn't pay such a huge price around that time. But he says that at some level it gets played out in two things. One is with the two-nation theory, and later with the creation of Bangladesh. But he says that none of these things go away. If it is a problematic idea, they remain. And if they are going to remain as a problematic idea, how are we going to deal with this? He raises a range of problematic ideas within the book: gender justice, economic justice, social justice. And if you're going to distill everything, the operative word is justice. Are we fair? But the question is not about instrumental idea of all these arrangements, but whether all these arrangements have its soul in its place. If it has to have its soul in its place, justice should be its fulcrum. It's not about economics, it's not about governance, it's not about policies, it's not about human development index, it's not about indexes, it's not about econometrics. It's primarily about our commitment to ethics and how we fare. Our home in the world is an idea of fair existence, and as I said earlier, it reminds me of Yadam Muthaiah or Kelir. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. Thank you, Panir. It was very interesting. And if there are some feedback, questions, comments, I would request you to send the comments on the chat box. We will recommend give it to Mr. Panir. And also people over here, if there are any questions, maybe you can get in touch with him later. As I mentioned earlier, we will not take any questions. This is a review of the book. But the idea of the book has been beautifully presented. I want to thank him once again. Join me in giving a thank to him once again. So this reading hub will happen every month, the first Saturday of every month at 6 p.m. It's a hybrid program. It will be physically presented here, and it's also going to be made available on the virtual medium. So people who are watching this can watch this over the people who can't come here. But I really request people who can come here physically, so that it will be really nice to meet people and have a face-to-face discussion. Thank you very much. Good evening.